Hello, and thanks for coming to my show. If you don't already know, this show is done in themed seasons, and we're on Season 18, Killer Kids. If you like this channel, not necessarily the crimes, you can hit like on the video and subscribe to the channel for weekly stories. You can also check out my other channel, Somewhere Sinister, which isn't entirely true crime, more true crime adjacent. A link is in the description. Thanks. At just before 1 a.m. on May 23, 1997, emergency services received a call from a man who said his 15-year-old daughter was missing. 3 New York City police officers arrived at the apartment building at 115 Central Park West on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where they found the concerned father pacing in the lobby. He told Officer Lee Furman that his daughter, Daphne, had not come home the previous evening and she was missing. The doorman to the building overheard that and told him that she wasn't missing. He had seen her and a boy enter the building a few minutes prior and go into a utility room at the back of the lobby. The father raced through the lobby into the utility room, and when he opened the door, he saw his daughter and a young boy naked, sitting inside a large utility sink, washing each other. The officers assumed they had just witnessed a couple of teenagers getting caught in the act, but as one looked at the clothing on the floor, he noticed a few drops of blood. He asked the teens where it came from, and Daphne told him that they had both fallen while rollerblading. She pointed out a gash on the back of her head and bruises and cuts on Christopher. The amount of blood that was on the clothes was very small and the story seemed to add up. So Officer Furman called in that the girl was located and the 3 left to allow the father to handle his daughter's indiscretion. At 1:42 a.m., an anonymous call was placed to 911 of a female telling the operator that there was a body in the lake at Central Park. When the operator asked for more details, the voice said, quote, "I didn't know what it was at first. Then I saw it was a body and freaked out and left." The operator asked for their phone number, but the caller hung up. Fortunately, by then, the emergency services system had caller ID, so the operator knew the phone number and address of the caller. Dispatch called out that there had been a caller who had reported a body at the lake in Central Park. Officer Furman picked up his radio and asked who the caller was, and the dispatcher responded that the call had come from 115 Central Park West, the building he and the other officers had just left. The officer turned his cruiser around and headed back to the building to find out exactly what was going on. This is Monsters. Daphne Abdela was born on May 18, 1982, and it's reported that her parents died in a car accident right after she was born. It's unclear where exactly she was born, most likely in New York, but when she was only 3 days old, she was adopted by Angelo and Catherine Abdella from Manhattan. Angelo was the vice president of CPC International, which owned a number of food brands such as Hellmann's and Skippy Peanut Butter. Catherine had previously worked as a model in France. The couple was quite wealthy and lived in a nice apartment in the Majestic, a building that has had many rich and famous people call it home. The Abdellas lived on the 20th floor facing Central Park, and when Daphne was old enough, she was enrolled at Columbia Grammar and Preparatory School, an expensive private school on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Daphne's life would incite jealousy by many less privileged. She went snowboarding in Vermont and sunbathing in the south of France. She lived in a fancy apartment and had anything she wanted. Daphne did well academically but was regularly put on probation for unruly behavior. She was seen as more of a tomboy and didn't fit in with the other kids. Other students who were involved in the same extracurricular activities saw her as unhappy despite her privilege. They never saw her smile or laugh. Other parents said that it seemed like Catherine wasn't able to control the girl. Daphne tended to walk in front of her mother and ignore her when she spoke. Like many young girls, Daphne eventually became self-conscious about her weight and attended a weight loss camp multiple times. Each time she did lose some weight and was complimented on her looks, but she didn't seem interested in the praise. As she got older, it seemed that she was only interested in arguing with the other people around her. Eventually, as she became a teenager, that anger began being focused outward on anyone. Her defiance was out in the open for anyone to see. She would stand outside near her apartment and smoke cigarettes. She would try to start arguments with random strangers just walking by. She began drinking excessively all the time. Friends said she always smelled like alcohol and was either actively drinking or on her way to buy some booze. At the end of 8th grade, Daphne was asked to leave Columbia. It was incredibly rare for a child to be kicked out of the prestigious school, but she caused too much trouble and they were no longer willing to accommodate her. She was then enrolled at the Loyola School on the Upper East Side, just across Central Park from where she lived. It was also an expensive private school, and when she first started attending, she seemed to be doing much better socially. She was well liked by other students, but there was a good reason for that. It seemed that Daphne was buying herself friends at the school. It was said that she would give other students money for a cab if they needed it, and even got a group of students fake IDs. She would buy them beer and even drugs. It didn't take long for other teens to realize that the money didn't make up for her unpredictable behavior. When she punched one other student in the face for no apparent reason, the other students began avoiding her. Daphne's drinking would have been considered out of control for an adult, let alone a 14-year-old. Schoolmates reported that she kept rum in her school locker and she was regularly drunk in class. When her parents found out, they sent her to a rehab program in Westchester for 2 weeks, and then she was supposed to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. She did go to the meetings, but just used it as a place to find other like-minded individuals to hang out with. She wasn't at her new school very long before she was asked to leave. By the middle of 1997, Daphne had been kicked out of her second private school and was ignoring any rule that was set by her parents. She spent her time smoking, drinking, and rollerblading around the city. At night, she would go into Central Park and find anyone to hang out with who would drink with her. In early 1997, Daphne was in Central Park when she met a 15-year-old named Christopher. Christopher Vasquez was born on January 1, 1982 in New York City to Gerardo Vasquez and Patricia Reedy. The couple had been high school sweethearts who lived in the south end of Spanish Harlem, the same neighborhood they had grown up in. Eventually, the couple split up, with Christopher and his older sister Jennifer staying with their mother. Patricia's parents lived right across the hall and they were all parishioners at the Roman Catholic Church right down the street. Christopher was an altar boy, and despite the couple not living together, they managed to make enough for their children to attend St. Ignatius Loyola Grammar School. In 3rd grade, Christopher suddenly became anxious and ran out of the classroom. He was diagnosed with a form of agoraphobia that made it difficult for him to be in public spaces. He was put on anti-anxiety medication but was unable to return to school, so he was homeschooled from then on. Both of his parents worked, so they cooperated in helping him complete his schoolwork. By all accounts, Christopher was a well-behaved child. He listened to his parents and didn't cause any problems. He was in the Boy Scouts and participated in scouting events. He loved to rollerblade and play roller hockey. In 1996, he finally returned to school at a high school that specialized in kids with special needs, whether they be social, physical, or learning needs. It was at that school that Christopher met a gang of kids who called themselves the East Coast Vandals. They were a group of rich kids from a number of different private schools throughout the city. They were said to pick on younger kids and video record themselves beating people up. It was after Christopher started hanging out with those kids that he started carrying a knife. It was a 4-inch or 10-centimeter folding knife. Even with his desire to be part of a group of kids causing trouble, people said Christopher was still a pretty good kid. He never fought and didn't drink as much as the others. Kids who knew him said that he had a low opinion of himself when he was younger, and that seemed to have messed him up a bit. Some said he had an empty look in his eyes. By 1997, Christopher was no longer obeying his mother's rules and would stay out past his curfew. Christopher was hanging out in the park watching two people fight when he ran into Daphne and the two started hanging out. Most people thought they were an odd pair. Despite both being really into rollerblading, Daphne was loud and aggressive and Christopher was quiet and friendly. Daphne was from a very rich family and Christopher's parents were working class. Still, the two became good friends and would hang out in the park, smoking, drinking, and rollerblading. In the middle of May in 1997, Christopher was riding the subway by himself when a group of kids jumped him. They stole his money and beat him up. After that, he went to the park and found some of the members of EVC and told them what had happened. Then he asked them to find the kids and retaliate for what they had done to him. That was when the gang informed him that he was not a member and they had no obligation to watch his back. He followed them around and wanted their approval, but they had never considered him a member of the gang. Christopher left the park dejected, and after that, friends said that the teen started drinking more heavily. He also started carrying a bigger knife. On May 22nd, all Daphne wanted to do was rollerblade in Central Park. Since she had been kicked out of school, she didn't have anything she had to do. The school said she could take the final exams from home at the end of the term, so she did study for those. Then she did whatever she wanted. That was usually drinking, smoking, and rollerblading. From her apartment at the Majestic, she skated across Central Park West and into the park at West 72nd Street. That took her into the park right near Strawberry Field, which is a memorial to the late Beatle John Lennon, who lived in the Dakota Building right across the street from that area of park at the time of his death. Daphne's apartment was just across West 72nd Street from the Dakota Building. Central Park is gigantic. It's 843 acres, 1.3 square miles or 3.4 square kilometers. It has a large reservoir, a lake, multiple ponds, a zoo, a castle, multiple playgrounds, and more than enough secluded areas that people can take part in any type of activity they want. Daphne spent the day hanging out with various people and eventually found some people to buy her a 40 of beer and some Philly cigars. When Christopher was out of school, he met up with Daphne and they began a campaign of antagonization of people in the park. Daphne bothered some other teenagers, then an older man playing chess. Then she found some boys that she already knew. The girl was getting herself worked up, and the other people who were in the area at the time said that Christopher tried to get her to calm down, but that wasn't Daphne's style. She and Christopher found two other rollerbladers and they raced around the city for a while before heading to a Blockbuster video store. There they rented the movie Reservoir Dogs and then went to Daphne's apartment. They had planned on watching the movie, but it was a nice evening and they decided they would rather be outside, so they headed back out into the city. The teens tried to hang out with a couple of different groups, but Daphne's aggressive personality was no interest to the others. They eventually left, bought beer, and returned with 4 six-packs of Heineken. As was usual for Daphne, she started handing out bottles of beer in an effort to buy friends. The group accepted the beer and thanked her before going back to their previous activities. Then Daphne noticed a man she recognized from an AA meeting. She handed him a beer and he thanked her. She asked him if he remembered her, and after thinking for a minute, he did. He introduced himself as Michael. Michael McMorrow was born on May 30th, 1952 in New York City to Charles and Maggie McMorrow. Charles had immigrated to the United States from Ireland in the 30s, and after serving in World War II, he went back to Ireland and married Maggie. Michael was the second youngest of 4 children who lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. As a child, Michael spent every day in Central Park playing baseball, basketball, and football. When Michael was about 10 years old, the building they lived in was slated for renovation and they were forced to move out of their home. They ended up in the Bronx in an area filled with other Irish immigrants. They felt right at home. From there, Michael grew up with his friends from school who all said he was a great athlete. They said he was an all-around decent guy who loved rock music and was against the Vietnam War. Like everybody else as a youth, he drank and partied. As the neighborhood kids started growing up, moving out and settling down, Michael never seemed to find the right woman. He began working in real estate, and as his friends moved on, he continued to drink. It was obvious that his father had a drinking problem, and it looked like Michael was going down the same path. Michael's life had become a routine of going to work during the day and drinking all night. He tried AA a few times, but it never seemed to stick. When his father died in 1982, that's when he rented an apartment on the Upper East Side and had Maggie come live with him to keep her company. Since he didn't want her to know how much he was drinking, he would go to the park and drink well into the night before walking home. Everybody around Michael said he was a warm and caring person. He would help out anyone in need. A neighbor said that he was always there anytime she needed a hand, and coworkers said that he was always the first to offer help when someone was in a bad spot. Though he was clearly struggling, as his alcohol addiction would suggest, he was always the one cracking jokes and laughing. On May 22, 1997, Michael had been working at Sir Realty for about 3 months, and he was very happy with the job. His shift started at 1 p.m. and he had some coffee before walking to work. On his way to the office, he stopped at the deli to buy beer and cigarettes. Every day, he would buy beer on his way to work and then put it in the fridge at the office. When he was finished with his shift, he would grab the cold beer and head to Strawberry Fields to drink and hang out with his friends. That night, he was sitting in the park listening to music and talking about baseball when a young girl offered him a bottle of Heineken. The girl was Daphne, and he had seen her at one of the AA meetings he had attended a few weeks prior. At about midnight, a police officer told the group the park was closed and they needed to leave. That wasn't true. The park was technically closed from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m., but arguing would just get them in trouble, and none of them wanted to risk a night in jail, so they picked up their belongings and dispersed. Daphne and Chris headed north towards a gazebo on the southwest side of the lake, and Michael said goodbye to his friends. As Michael started walking up the path toward his apartment, he ran into Daphne and Christopher, who still had beer and weren't ready to call it a night. He went with them to the gazebo, and the three continued drinking. At some point between midnight and 1 a.m., the teenagers attacked and killed Michael. It's unknown why the attack happened. Later, the media would print a number of rumors. One was that Michael had made a pass at Daphne, which enraged Christopher, and he ended up stabbing him to death. After that, people would go on to question why Michael was hanging out in the park with young kids, even speculating that he was a pedophile. Investigators would later report that they couldn't find anything in Michael's past that would suggest that he had ever been interested in underage girls. Or boys, for that matter. His friends would go on to say that he had never really shown much interest in being in an intimate relationship and that his two real loves were his mother and alcohol. It's believed that Michael didn't really care what age his companions were. They had the booze, so that's where he wanted to be. Daphne would later tell a story that she and Christopher decided to go skinny dipping, and when they got out of the lake, after putting their clothes back on, she was still cold, so Michael put his arm around her to help her warm up. That enraged Chris, and he stabbed Michael to death. Of course, that story would eventually change, so nobody believes it happened. Officer Furman had taken the missing persons call at 115 Central Park West and headed back to the same building about an hour later after the call had come in that there was a body in the lake. By the time they got to the Majestic, Christopher had already been picked up by his mother. Daphne explained to the officers that Christopher had killed a man in Central Park and that she was afraid of him. That's why she waited until he had left to make the call. The officers were suspicious as Daphne calmly ate a plate of mac and cheese while she told them that Christopher had freaked out and killed a guy. She told them that the man's name was Michael McMorrow and that he had cut him up and gutted him. As much as the officer didn't believe Daphne's story, he called it in anyway. Then the officers had Daphne take them to the location of the murder. As they got near the gazebo, they saw blood drops on the path. Next to the gazebo was a large puddle of blood, and right in the water was Michael's body. Daphne told the officers that she had tried to give him CPR. Then she also told them that, when it was clear that Michael was dead, she told Christopher to gut the body so it would sink. The officers found it odd that, not only would she be so calm recounting such a horrible story, she would offer advice to the murderer as to how to better hide the body. Nothing about the case made sense, and at no point would the case ever become more understandable. In the lake, Michael's body had been cut open and his intestines were floating in the water all around him. His hands had been almost severed, but not completely. His throat was slashed and he had been stabbed multiple times. Both Christopher and Daphne were arrested and held while investigators gathered evidence. The prosecutor went to the police station and tried to talk to both teens, but neither family would allow it. They both hired lawyers who began working to keep the 15-year-olds out of prison. Detective Rob Mooney was assigned to the case, and he was well known in the precinct. How could he not be? At 6'4" or 193 centimeters with a large build and an imposing presence, he had no problem commanding a homicide investigation. He arrived at the scene at around 8:15 a.m. and surveyed the work that was already underway. He saw the body, including the horrific condition it was in, and found out from the other detectives on the scene that 2 teenagers had been taken into custody. He had his work cut out for him in this case. About an hour later, the body made it to the medical examiner's office and was ready for autopsy. The ME determined that Michael had died by sharp force trauma. He had been stabbed in his face and hands multiple times, likely the initial attack as he was trying to defend himself. Then it seemed as though he fell backwards, and then he was stabbed repeatedly on the left side of his chest in the same area. It's believed that he was no longer moving when he was stabbed in the chest. Then someone attempted to slash his throat and remove his hands. His abdomen was then cut open and he was disemboweled. The attacker had placed rocks inside his body to try to help it sink in the lake. There were also bruises on the back of one of his legs that were 4 equal-sized circles that were in a perfectly straight line. From that point, the investigators went to work gathering evidence. At Daphne's apartment, they found her rollerblades, 2 pagers, and a watch with blood on it. Inside her dresser, they found Michael's wallet, which she had previously told detectives that they had destroyed. In the apartment building's utility room, they collected blood from the sink that the teens had been bathing in. At Christopher's apartment, they recovered U.S. currency that was believed to have been stolen from Michael, and the clothing he was wearing during the murder. An officer had seen Daphne and Christopher leaving the scene and described the clothing that the boy was wearing. They found the exact outfit in his bedroom. Investigators also found a knife in his room that looked clean but would end up having traces of blood on it. On May 24th, both Daphne and Christopher were arraigned in front of Judge Ira F. Beale. Daphne's lawyer, a former special assistant to the state attorney general, explained that he had not received the documents from the case or a recording of the 911 call that Daphne had made. He was given time to review those documents before any formal plea was entered. Christopher was taken to court later that day, and while there, he began muttering to himself and the detectives became concerned about his well-being. Without the knowledge of anyone else, the detectives got an order to have the teen taken to Bellevue Hospital and placed under psychiatric observation. Before the arraignment began, they escorted him out of the courtroom and to the hospital. Neither his parents nor his lawyer knew what was going on. His lawyer, who had been hired by his parents, went to Bellevue Hospital to try to talk to his client but was turned away. Soon after, the Vasquez family let him know that they no longer needed his services and they had hired a new lawyer. During the days that Christopher was being evaluated by psychiatrists, Daphne's parents also fired her lawyer and hired a new one. Daphne's new lawyer was Benjamin Brofman, who was a former Manhattan ADA who had represented a large number of rich and famous clients since he had moved to defense. He was known for using the media to his advantage in a case. He would make statements that would plant the seeds of doubt in the public's minds. Christopher's new lawyer was Arnold Chris, who was quite the opposite of Brofman. He was quiet and reserved and played things close to the vest. Neither lawyer was cheap, and they would both be determined to earn their pay. Christopher was only in the hospital for a few days, and most think he was just trying to get attention when he mumbled in court about some things he might do to himself. Back in court, both Daphne and Christopher were charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of first-degree robbery. The first count of murder was for causing the death of Michael McMorrow. The second was to add, quote, under circumstances evincing a depraved indifference to human life, reckless endangerment in conduct which created a grave risk of death to another person. The third was for the murder being during the commission of a robbery. The 2 counts of robbery were for the theft of Michael's belongings, being his wallet and cash, and for causing serious bodily harm or death in the process. There are a lot of overlapping charges, but that's ultimately how a sentence gets increased in a case where a person commits multiple felonies during the same crime. In this case, both the teens would be charged as adults but would be sentenced as juveniles. They both pleaded not guilty. Before the trials, Daphne's lawyer reached out to the prosecutor and wanted to make a deal. Not necessarily a plea deal, but he was convinced that Daphne's perceived level of involvement in the murder was a misunderstanding, and he wanted to allow the prosecutor to interview her with something called a proffer. Sometimes referred to as a queen for a day deal, that's where a defendant can talk to investigators and/or the prosecutor and nothing they say can be used against them in court. The only reason any of it can be brought up in court is if they testify to something that doesn't match what they said during the proffer interview. What her lawyer was trying to do was to convince the prosecutor that Daphne was a witness, not an accomplice. So Daphne met with Detective Rob Mooney and went over her story again. She explained that they had been rollerblading in the park, ran into Michael with a number of other people, and when they were told to leave by the officer, she and Christopher went to a gazebo by the lake. Michael followed them, still wanting to drink, and during this interview is when Daphne first mentioned that she and Christopher decided to go skinny dipping. After they got out, Michael put his arm around her in an attempt to warm her up, and Christopher freaked out. It's said that Christopher thought Michael was trying to make advances at Daphne, but even today it's never been made clear what type of relationship Christopher and Daphne had. It's never been confirmed that they were in a romantic relationship, and there are accounts of the case where Daphne was flirting with 2 ex-boyfriends on the day before the murder. It's all kinda hazy. Also, the claim that they went skinny dipping has never been confirmed, so it's not known if Michael really had put his arm around Daphne, let alone if he even had a reason to, such as her shivering. To the detective, it was just a story, and it was likely being crafted to make her out to be less involved, making her a witness instead of an accomplice. But it still didn't add up to the detective, and he wasn't just going to take her word for it. That's when Detective Mooney asked if he could talk to Daphne some more to try to corroborate her story, and her lawyer agreed. The problem was that future interviews would not be part of the proffer agreement, and instead of accompanying Daphne to those interviews himself to ensure she didn't say anything that would hurt her case, he sent a junior associate. During the subsequent interviews, Mooney produced a picture of a line of round bruises that had been found on the back of Michael's leg. Daphne couldn't come up with an explanation, so then Mooney pulled one of the rollerblades out of an evidence box and showed her the part of the skate that perfectly matched the bruises. Daphne then said that she had kicked Michael in the leg after Christopher had attacked him, claiming she thought he was going to hurt her friend and she needed to help him. It was at that point that Daphne officially admitted that she had in fact participated in the attack and was not just a witness. Unsurprisingly, Daphne soon changed her plea to guilty and took a deal. She pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was given the maximum sentence 3 to 9 years and was not required to testify against Christopher. Manslaughter is when your actions caused someone's death but you didn't think they would. She would go on to say in court that she had aided Christopher by kicking Michael's feet out from under him, causing him to fall backwards, but she didn't think that he would die. The prosecutor was not interested in a deal with Christopher. Their case that he had murdered Michael was strong. He had blood on him, his clothes, and the murder weapon was found in his bedroom. His trial started on November 9, 1998, at the Supreme Court of New York County. The prosecutor described the brutality of the murder. Christopher had stabbed and slashed Michael multiple times in the face and hands. Then, Daphne had kicked the man, causing him to fall to the ground. That's when Christopher climbed on top of the man who had already become immobile due to his wounds and stabbed him in the chest. He struck his heart, aorta, and lungs. When Michael was dead, he sliced his throat and then tried to hide the man's identity by cutting off his hands, but was unsuccessful. Then he cut open his belly and put rocks inside his body before pushing him into the lake. He then described the evidence against the teen. The bloody clothes and the microscopic blood on the knife, which was tested and was a match for Michael. When blood from the crime scene was tested, some came back a match for Christopher. There was no doubt that Christopher Vasquez had murdered Michael McMorrow. The evidence against Christopher was strong, so the defense strategy was to try to convince the jury that Daphne had actually carried out the murder. He claimed that she had murdered Michael, tried to cover it up, and then pointed the finger at his client. He reminded the jury that he didn't have to prove that Daphne was the murderer. All he needed to do was point out the reasonable doubt. The defense said that witnesses after the murder claimed that Christopher was the more calm of the two, but that wasn't backed up by the officers who responded to the missing person call. They described Daphne as being calm and Christopher as being aggressive and cagey. At one point, he got right up in one officer's face and said, quote, "I'm not afraid of you." When the lawyers were done making their cases, the judge sent the jury to deliberate. But before he did, he gave them an option to find Christopher guilty of first-degree manslaughter if they couldn't agree to find him guilty of murder. When the verdict was reached, the jury found him guilty of manslaughter, which was what the prosecutor was afraid of. He believed that they had found it hard to convict him of murder because of his age, but if they hadn't had the option of manslaughter, they ultimately would have, since it wouldn't have been right to find him not guilty. The judge ended up giving Christopher the same sentence as he had given to Daphne, 3 to 9 years in prison. The McMorrow family was outraged by the verdict. If it was to be accepted, it meant that Christopher had stabbed Michael 38 times in the face and chest and didn't think it would cause Michael's death. It didn't add up. It was clearly at least a second-degree murder, and in their minds, Michael had not received the justice he deserved. In December of 1998, the McMorrow family filed a $150 million wrongful death suit against Daphne and Christopher. Joan McMorrow said, quote, "Our family's loss is not lessened because Michael was senselessly murdered by a juvenile. Our pain and suffering is not lessened because Michael was brutally butchered by a juvenile. Therefore, why should their sentence be less? What's the point of having them tried as adults only to have them sentenced as juveniles? Why was the jury not made aware that he'd be sentenced as a juvenile?" The McMorrows eventually got a $60,000 settlement from the Abdellas, and they used some of the money to buy a memorial bench in Central Park. Daphne was sent to Tryon Girls Center in upstate New York. She attended classes, received counseling, and had a job washing dishes in the kitchen. She was also required to attend anger management and substance abuse sessions. She got her GED and took college classes. She became eligible for parole in 2000, but was denied parole the first few times. She was moved to an adult prison, also in upstate New York, in 2003. There she began working as a welder, and she had a clean record while she was there. New York law says that an inmate must be released after 2/3 of their sentence has been served as long as they've had good behavior. So Daphne was released on January 16, 2004. When she arrived back at the Majestic, she told the waiting reporters to fuck off and went inside with her father. Catherine had died of a heart attack in 2002. Christopher's lawyer filed an appeal, but it was denied. He was also moved to an adult prison in 2003 and would serve the rest of his time at Wyoming Correctional Facility, which is in New York, not Wyoming. Like Daphne, he also learned to weld in prison and studied general mechanics. Christopher received a disciplinary ticket for smoking while there, but that was his one and only infraction. He was released just a few days after Daphne was in 2004. They both had strict parole guidelines to follow and were barred from ever seeing each other. When Christopher returned to his father's apartment, it was his father who was most aggressive to the reporters, but that was still only him shooing them away. Christopher remained quiet and has stayed relatively off the radar. Daphne has not been as quiet since her release. Just a few days after her release, one of Michael's park buddies found a note on the memorial bench in Central Park. It read, quote, "Rest easy. I tried to save you. I'm sorry I failed you. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you and your family." It was signed D. Michael's friend went to the Majestic, where the doorman confirmed that Daphne had been released a few days prior. The note was a painful attempt for Daphne to absolve herself from blame in Michael's death. It showed that she wasn't taking responsibility for her actions and was likely not fully reformed. That would be confirmed about 9 months later when she was arrested for making threatening phone calls to another former inmate, saying, quote, "If you leave your house, I'm going to kill you." She was charged with misdemeanor aggravated harassment but did not return to prison. In 2009, Daphne filed a lawsuit against two people she had gotten into a car accident with. She claimed that she had been, quote, "rendered sick, sore, lame, and disabled, experiencing mental anguish and great pain and suffering." The details of the accident and the outcome of the lawsuit are unknown. This season is filled with horrible murderers that seem to have light sentences, and that's because the theme focuses on minors who have committed murder. Generally, young offenders get tried and sentenced as juveniles, which results in lighter sentences. Juveniles generally haven't developed enough physically and emotionally to have a full understanding of their actions and are believed to be more easily rehabilitated. Fortunately, I believe that works out to be true more often than not, and in this case, it seems unlikely that the monsters who killed Michael will go on to kill again. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.